Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Life is Short and So Am I, My Life Inside, Outside, and Under the Wrestling Ring by Dylan Hornswoggle Postl, with Ross Owen Williams and Ian Douglas. Narrated by Dylan Hornswoggle Postl. Foreword by Kofi Kingston. Let me preface this by saying that Dylan has agreed not to read this foreword until his book publishes. I don't know why anyone would actually request that I do this to them. Dylan, you fool. Now clearly, many of you listening to this are wrestling fans. That means that you know the author of this book as Hornswoggle, a man of seemingly endless gimmicks. What you may not know is that this is an art imitating life situation, because in real life, actual Dylan Postl has endless aliases. Allow me to elaborate by highlighting 3 of many. Alias 1. Doo-Doo Dylan. This title was initially earned when Dylan and I were on a drive from New Orleans to Baton Rouge. 12 minutes into the ride, he started to flip out, demanding that I pull over and find a bathroom because his stomach was tore up. When he finally returned to the car, he had a glazed-over look in his eyes. When I asked if everything was okay, he just stared forward in silence for what seemed like forever. Finally, voice quivering, he said that the bathroom resembled a murder scene, but instead of blood, it was poop. On the floors, on the walls, on the ceiling, everywhere. I could see from the tears welling up in his eyes that he was neither lying nor exaggerating. Looking closer, I noticed that he was half smiling. Not because he was joking, but because he was kind of proud. A true savage, but he did at least manage to avoid getting any poop on his clothes before getting into the car, so as far as I was concerned, we were cool. We drove on. He then proceeded to inform me that he gifts himself the option of 3 self-poops a year. I take him at his word because, I don't want to be responsible for keeping that tally. The honor system will just have to do. Alias 2. Big Nick from New Jersey. Jersey, said with the accent of a squeaky-voiced 1930s gangster from Boardwalk Empire. I won't go into too much detail about this one because it will be talked about later in this book, but I will say that this could be the single worst, half-hearted, quarter-assed, and consequently comical attempt at an accent in human history. The Big Nick moniker is all that remains of the greatest character to never happen. Alias 3. The Soda-Free Loda. Kurt Hawkins, Swoggle, and I traveled together often, known amongst ourselves as Team 2.5 Men. One day, we inevitably decided to stop for food, but Swoggle had just eaten and didn't want anything. Hawkins and I proceeded to order while Swoggle repeatedly insisted he wasn't hungry and didn't want to order a diddle-damn thing. Direct quote. But he finally broke down and ordered a cola. When the bill came, the waitress gave Swoggle a check for somewhere around $1.37. His eyes got wide as anger and pure utter disgust built steadily upon his face. His eyebrows furrowed, and his bottom lip started to fold downward toward the floor. Steam actually started to rise from his scalp. The waitress was completely oblivious to all of this, by the way. Dylan then started to shake his head left to right, slowly at first, but quickly building to a close-eyed, rapid, and aggressive, full-body Eric Cartman-esque shudder, culminating in a high-pitched shriek to the gods, causing the entire restaurant to stare with legitimate concern. The tantrum finished with him violently shoving the tab across the table to me and Hawkins before he stormed out and back to the car. Later, we came to find out that in his hometown of Appleby, Wisconsin, it is known as fact, and in some areas as law, that he is never to ever actually pay for a soda under any circumstances. Even though we were nowhere near his hometown, Dylan couldn't believe this rule was not intergalactic common knowledge. It's important to note that in his everyday persona, Dylan is not at all an entitled person. Actually, quite the opposite, which is what makes the tale of the soda-free Loda that much funnier. It's also important to note that I may or may not have enhanced some or all of the details for the sake of a more humorous scenario. Either way, this is how we choose to remember this story. There are so many more stories like these that I just do not have the time for in this foreword, but Dylan and I traveled together for years, and tales like these were commonplace. As time went on, each weekend they became fully expected. I am 7 and 8 years older than my siblings. I always think about how jealous I am of the bond my little brother and sister had because being a year apart, they did everything together. They grew up together, they went to school together, they hung out and partied together. I never had that special kind of bonding experience with a sibling until I met Dylan. My friendship with Dylan filled that void. I consider him wholeheartedly as my brother, the Krillin to my Goku. He is one of the only people that I can actually tolerate sharing a hotel room with on the road. He was, and still is, my Royal Rumble moment consultant. He's one of the few people I looked to for advice and experience as I was preparing for fatherhood. Most importantly, and this is easily my absolute favorite of Dylan's qualities, he's always been completely honest. This book certainly reflects that to the fullest, as it is an apologetically honest account of his life story. Interestingly enough, for all the years that we traveled together and got to know each other, I don't think we ever discussed the intimate details of his journey. I thoroughly enjoyed reading about them. His story is compelling, emotional, and very entertaining. I know you all will love and appreciate it as much as I did. Kofi Sarkodie Mensah, a.k.a. Kofi Kingston. Forward by Kurt Hawkins. As I'm sitting down to write this, I can't help but laugh to myself. Dylan Postl and I have next to nothing in common. He's a vertically challenged fellow from small-town Wisconsin, and I'm a 6'1", fast-talking New Yorker. We grew up in completely different worlds. Our friendship makes absolutely no sense on paper. But our common bond is what brought us together. We both have an almost disturbing level of love for professional wrestling. Professional wrestling is a form of entertainment unlike any other on the planet, something that I saw for my first time as a small child and became completely fascinated by. And Dylan did too. I can't believe they had cable in Oshkosh in the 90s. We became friends almost immediately. Together, we got to do what we love for a living and travel the world. Riding up and down the roads of America, telling stories, making memories, and always completely busting each other's balls. There's an old saying in pro wrestling that you do most of your integral learning in bars and the cars. I found this to be true, but through my experiences, it's also where the most invaluable friendships are forged as well. Dylan and I have always been very honest with each other. I know he's always going to tell me what he thinks, whether it's something I want to hear or not. That aspect of our relationship is something that I'll always cherish. I am so proud of Dylan. This guy's never had it easy, but he never made excuses for himself either. He just continued to defy the odds. Dylan, although it pains me to say it, is an incredible performer inside of a professional wrestling ring. But that's not the best version of Dylan. The best version of Dylan can be seen when he's home with his son Landon, being a father. Dylan is an absolute megadad. He's done all he can to build the best life for his son, and that's an inspiration. Dylan, I love you, pal. Brian Myers, a.k.a. Kurt Hawkins. Preface. May 23rd, 2006. The Rabobank Arena, Bakersfield, California. My name is Finlay, and I love to fight. The voice of Dave Fit Finlay boomed over the sound system, followed by his intimidating Celtic theme entrance music. Of the several thousand people in the arena who heard it, I was the only one who couldn't see the barrel-chested, gap-toothed, fighting Irishman approaching the ring. Finlay climbed through the ropes and stomped across the mat, each footstep reverberating beneath the ring where I sat alone, dressed as a leprechaun, in the darkness that I've been afraid of as far back as I can remember. This was to be my debut with World Wrestling Entertainment, a company I dreamed about being part of since before I learned to walk. To say I was nervous would be an understatement. As Finlay's opponent Paul Burchill made his way to the ring, I tried to distract myself from my nerves by reflecting on everything that had led me to this moment. I thought of the multiple surgeries I had to endure as a kid, and how I'd play RBI baseball on my old NES while trapped in a full-body cast at the hospital. I thought of the house fire that destroyed my childhood home, and the yellow rubber ducky sitting on the bathtub that somehow survived the blaze. I thought of my brother and my mom, who both left my life so early, and of my grandpa, who believed in me when no one else did. Most of all, I thought of my dad, and how I wanted to show him that the son he raised was going to amount to something. As the match began above me, the butterflies in my stomach turned into elephants. My heart was pounding in my chest. What if I messed up? What if it went the same way as when we'd rehearsed the spot earlier in the day? when the first impression I made on the most powerful man in the wrestling industry wasn't good at all. Everything I had worked for all came down to what I did in the 60 seconds after that green light came on. If I blew it, my run in the big leagues would be as short as me. I kept myself focused on the task at hand. It was simple. I just had to crawl out from underneath the ring, give WWE owner Vince McMahon the Tasmanian devil he wanted, and everything would be fine. Then there would hopefully be a second week, and further weeks beyond that. Who knew how long it would last? Sitting in the dark under the ring in Bakersfield, I had no idea that it was the first of what would end up being more than 500 weeks with the company. I couldn't know I'd visit volcanoes in Ecuador and get chased by roosters in Guadalajara. I couldn't know I'd appear in feature films and meet my childhood heroes. And I certainly couldn't know I'd surprise everyone with exciting matches at big WWE events, or that I'd climb a ladder in the middle of the ring at Ford Field looking around at 80,000 screaming fans and thinking, how did a midget from Oshkosh, Wisconsin make it to WrestleMania? I heard the referee's hand strike the mat 3 times, the bell rang, and Finlay's music started up again. This was it. The green light came on, the ring apron was lifted up, I took a deep breath, then scurried out from the darkness and into the spotlight. Chapter 1. The Coffee Table. I'm fine with the word midget. A lot of little people consider that term insulting, and some get really worked up when they hear it. Others steer clear of it for fear of causing offense, like the time wrestling commentator Michael Cole accidentally used it and Vince McMahon went off on him, yelling, "You can never say that. Ever. It's so demeaning." When there's a need to make reference to my diminutive stature, most regular-sized people get stuck. As the moment approaches, they'll start to look like a deer in the headlights. Some people will say midget, and then they'll backtrack and tie themselves up in knots and stumble over their words. Others will use people like you, which I don't mind. I far prefer that to option 3, where they'll pause, look awkward, and eventually go with, I don't really know how to say it. The level of panic it can create can be quite hilarious. Usually, though, I won't let it get that far. I'll just jump in and say, midget is fine, and they'll breathe a sigh of relief. Honestly, I've never once had a problem with the word. I always say the word midget makes me money. You used to see midget wrestling all the time on wrestling posters for shows, and it would help draw a crowd. I never feel like I'm being ridiculed or marginalized by the word, and, as you can hear in this book, I use it liberally myself. It's just a word, and it can only be offensive if the person using it means it as an insult. And even then, it's not the word that offends, it's the attitude. Some people only see a little person when they look at me. Others see me for who I am. Being small is part of who I am, but not the only part. I don't consider it my defining characteristic and never have. I can't change it, so it's not worth getting upset about. My parents learned I was going to be undersized midway through the pregnancy. The news came as a shock. There was no history of dwarfism on either side of the family. My mom already had 2 children from a previous marriage, and they were both normal-sized. Dad was 34 and Mom was 26. Neither could be considered an older parent with a higher risk of having a baby with complications. The delivery itself was straightforward as childbirth ever is, and in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, on May 29, 1986, I was born Dylan Mark Postl, with my middle name being chosen for my dad's brother, who had died of cardiomyopathy when he was 18. There are different kinds of dwarfism. I have achondroplasia, which is the most common and presents the fewest health issues. I have a normal-sized torso with an oversized skull and short, bowed arms and legs. My condition is far more noticeable when I'm standing up, but when I'm sitting, I'm about the same height as a normal person. Because of the size of my head and arms, you'd still notice I was different, but it's not as obvious when I'm off my feet. In the first few years of my life, there was no difference between me and other kids in terms of many developmental milestones, such as starting to speak, but it did take me longer to learn how to walk because I was top-heavy and born with scoliosis, a curvature of the spine which is common in little people. When I was 6, I underwent corrective surgery for that. What was supposed to be a relatively straightforward procedure didn't go to plan because the surgeon had never operated on a little person before. He had assumed my insides would be the same as a normal person, but once he'd opened me up, he found everything was completely different in there. He attempted to put a rod in my back to straighten my spine, but it didn't work, and worse still, pinched a nerve which paralyzed me from the waist down. Fortunately, shortly after the surgery, I regained full use of my lower half, but that had been terrifying for my parents. I still have some complications from this, though. My feet always feel like they are at different temperatures. My right foot is always much colder than my left. There will also be 3 or 4 times each year when I'll have a day or two where I'll feel like I'm constantly being electrocuted in my feet. It's not much fun, but things could have been a lot worse. Although I was only partially paralyzed for a short time, I was still bedridden for a couple of months, confined to a full body cast that went from under my armpits to just above my groin. Even when I was released from the hospital, the cast came with me, and I had to wear it until it was time for the surgeons to try again. I don't remember much about my first surgery, but I do have several memories of the second. You may think that going into a major surgery at the age of 7 would be terrifying, but my parents told me everything would be fine. That was all I needed to hear, and at that age, I didn't think too hard about potential complications. I just knew it was something that needed to happen to fix my back. The second surgery went much more smoothly. The new surgeon removed one of my ribs and fused it into my back, along with a metal rod. When I came around afterward, I found I was sporting the familiar full body cast. I was laid up in the hospital again, unable to go home, so my parents came in to visit me as much as they could, and my dad's parents, Grandpa and Grandma Postl, were regular visitors who went out of their way to make sure I knew how much they cared. The other side of the family was a much different story. My mom's parents never once visited me at any of the times I was in the hospital. It felt like they were embarrassed. I needed as much support as I could get since I couldn't do anything for myself. I wasn't even able to get to the bathroom, which meant bedpans and bottles. And whenever I couldn't manage to pee, which was often, I had to get catheters. I remember that they were bright red and hurt like hell. The moment I'd see one being brought in toward me, I'd start crying. My family was always there to hold my hand, but I would bawl my eyes out. Dad was always so sad for me because I'd had to have catheters so frequently, sometimes a couple of times in a single day. Even the nurses hated doing it because they felt so bad for me. On top of the daily catheterization, I had to have regular blood tests too. I guess that's where my fear of needles comes from. The nurses were great though. They did everything they could to make the best of a bad situation, and always made sure I had my stuffed animal and my blanket. I actually had 2 blankets, and they used to put one in the freezer. Whenever the one I had got too warm and uncomfortable, they'd switch it with the one in the freezer. To this day, I can't sleep when I get too warm. Toward the end of my stay in the hospital, we had water fights, which aren't as fun when you can't really move, but they're better than doing nothing. The nurses would spray me with these huge syringes filled with water, and I'd splash them right back with my water bottle. There was only so much the nurses could do to keep me occupied, so to help me with the boredom, Dad brought in a Nintendo Entertainment System, and we played a ton of RBI baseball. I'd spend all day looking forward to seeing Dad in the evening and playing that NES into the night. Those visits were everything to me. RBI baseball was the only thing we'd play. It carried on to being our thing after I got back home and remained something we'd do together for many years. No matter what other video game systems I would get through the years, we'd always keep the NES and RBI baseball. Some of my favorite childhood memories come from that, especially how fired up Dad would get whenever I'd bunt and get an easy base. Even after I'd been discharged, the full body cast had to stay on. Being trapped in that cast 24 hours a day was uncomfortable at best, and over summer, I would become so overheated that I'd itch all over and have to use a fork to try to scratch myself. Whenever I managed to get that fork into an itch, it was a great feeling. But better still was the brief period every few months when I would get cut out of the cast. As much as I looked forward to the outcome, the process of getting the cast off was terrifying. The doctor had to use an electric saw to cut into the plaster. In reality, the saw wasn't very big, but in my young mind, this grown man was using a chainsaw on me. I was always scared he was going to saw into my chest. There was a horrendous noise as the blade cut, plaster went everywhere, and I'd cry my eyes out. It was worth it, though. When they pulled the cast apart and I could feel the air on my chest, it was the best feeling in the world. They'd put me in a fresh cast shortly thereafter, but I always looked forward to those few minutes of freedom every few months. One of the main problems with being in the cast was that I'd found it impossible to stand upright, so if I wanted to get anywhere at home, I'd have to roll from room to room. Everyone laughed at first, but after a while, the novelty wore off, and it just became an everyday part of life. I learned to walk before my first surgery, but a couple years in the body cast had set me back a lot. My physical therapy sessions didn't seem to be helping at all, and I started to wonder if I'd ever be able to walk again. One day at home, I decided I'd had enough rolling or being carried everywhere. While my parents were in their bedroom, I pulled myself up against the wall in the hallway and started taking little kicking steps with my arms out in front of me for balance. I must have looked like Tommy from Rugrats, My mom came out of the bedroom, saw me, and gasped, "Oh my God." All I could say was, "Hi, Mom." She was already crying as she shouted for my dad to come out and see. They tried to get me to walk to them, but I told them to grab me and hold my hands because I didn't know if I'd hurt myself if I fell. Gradually, though, I got the hang of walking. Just being able to get from room to room standing upright felt like a miracle. Another weight that was lifted when I was permanently freed from the cast, even though I was moved straight into a back brace that I had to wear 90% of the time. It was made of hard plastic with Velcro and straps for fastening. It was a challenge to get on and off because it was so tight, and if you bent the plastic too much, it would break. Dad would always be the one to help me with it, and a few times the brace would slip out of his grasp, pinch my skin, and it would hurt like hell, causing yet more tears. He felt so bad whenever that happened. That plastic brace presented problems for other people too. Whenever I'd spend time at Grandpa and Grandma Postl's house, which I'd love doing, I would lean on the coffee table in their living room, and the bottom of the brace would get caught and scratch it up. My grandparents didn't care about the scuffing, but once I was out of the brace, Dad made sure to have the table refinished so that I was presentable again. Those weren't the only surgeries I had to endure as a child. I found out that I had a tumor on my eardrum when I was 11. It was affecting my hearing, so it had to be removed. Just like with my first back surgery, the doctor wasn't prepared for the job. Shortly after he'd put me under and opened me up, he hit an artery. Once that was under control, the doctor decided he wasn't the right man for the job, closed me back up, and called someone else. 3 months later, just after I turned 12, another surgeon removed the tumor successfully, though the surgery left a scab on my eardrum that is still there today. It affects my hearing in that ear and gets infected at least once every 6 months. I was always confused as to why the doctors weren't more prepared for what they found. Maybe everything looked normal enough on the scan and x-rays, but it seemed to me that the people who were performing my first back and ear surgeries cut me open and said, "Hold on, why is this here?" I've joked a few times to Dad that if that sort of thing happened now, the malpractice lawsuits would have made us millionaires. Dad says that everyone was just doing the best they could, and all anyone wanted was for me to get better. Looking back, I went through physical hell in my preteen years. I don't know many people who have a single major surgery before they become a teenager, let alone 4. On top of that, you've got all the associated complications that come with my stature, but honestly, I didn't feel that different from any other kid. My teachers treated me the same as everyone else, and that was the way I wanted it. My dad echoed that behavior, but Mom had her own ways of dealing with my condition. Chapter 2. The Rubber Ducky. I didn't grow up as the only little person in town. When I was a kid, my mom took me to meet the other person in Oshkosh who was affected by dwarfism. He was an older guy, nice enough if slightly weird. But the main memory I have of that day isn't the little person. It's of how confused I was. Why was my mom making me meet this little old guy? Was she trying to tell me, "Dylan, this is your future"? Was she trying to show me how different I was from all the normal-sized people? I didn't get it. As far as I was concerned, I was just a kid. It didn't feel like Mom saw me the same way. I first realized my mom's need for the spotlight when I returned to school after my second back surgery. I didn't want to make a big deal of it, but Mom made it into Dylan's comeback to elementary school, like it was some sort of major event. She had me do an announcement over the school's public address system to say I was back, and then paraded me in my wheelchair from classroom to classroom, getting everyone to clap as I handed out a piece of gum to each kid. I just wanted to be like any other kid, but Mom went out of her way to see that things changed for me. Before long, the school had a shorter toilet, shorter drinking fountain, and a shorter swing just for me. Every classroom I was in had a shorter desk and a chair with a foam backrest and footrest. Even at the age of 6, I remember thinking, why are they doing all this? You might think these were the actions of a protective mother who was making sure her kid was looked after. There might have been an element of that, but in time I came to realize, whether she knew it or not, that it was mostly about getting attention for herself. Being the mother of the little kid gave her an identity. She didn't care how, she just cared that everyone knew her. It felt like she would use me to get sympathy for what she must have been going through as the mom of the midget. The reality is, however, I never viewed myself as different from any of the other kids. Although I was my dad's first child, I was my mom's third. She already had 2 kids, Tara and Clint, from a previous marriage. She and their biological dad had divorced not long after Clint was born, and my dad had come into the picture shortly thereafter and raised both kids as his own. By the time I was born, Clint was 7 and Tara was 9. I never looked on them as anything other than my full brother and sister, and they felt the same about me. By then, Mom was their only living biological parent. Her ex-husband had died by suicide when Clint was just 3. I shared a bedroom with Clint, and while there was a big age gap, we were very close. Whenever Mom wasn't around, he'd cook meals for me and make sure I got to and from school. Clint was the one who first introduced me to wrestling by giving me some of his WWF action figures. He drew the line at letting me use his toy wrestling ring, though, so my dad built me a wooden replica to stop me complaining. As well as being the person behind my lifelong love of wrestling, Clint was also responsible for my lifelong fear of the dark. We slept in bunk beds. He had the top bunk, and I had the bottom one. Whenever cars would go past our house, their headlights illuminated the ceiling of our second-floor bedroom. Clint told me they were ghosts, and I was young enough to believe him. He didn't help matters by swinging his head down over the edge of the top bunk and scaring the shit out of me when I was trying to go to sleep. He was also a sleepwalker, so I'd never know if he would be in his bed or not, and that scared me too. My parents sometimes found him standing around in the kitchen or the laundry room. On one occasion, when I was half asleep, he fell clean out of the bed. I saw a body drop and land with a huge thud on the floor right next to me. It was a hell of a bump, but somehow he wasn't hurt at all. I was scared to death, though. I pulled the covers over my head, closed my eyes tight, and tried to go back to sleep. My family was very big on traveling, and every summer we would go on a trip. One year we went out to Montana, and the next year we went to Disney World. My Disney fanaticism started when I was very young. We went to Disney for the first time in 1992. I remember going on Space Mountain, which scared both Dad and I half to death. I didn't like that or the Star Wars ride at MGM, but I thought the overall experience was amazing. I loved meeting the characters and seeing the castle. The whole thing felt so magical to me. We went to Universal Studios as well, and that was awesome too. The only bad part of the whole vacation was that I was in a wheelchair after one of my back surgeries. That sucked, but it wasn't the real problem. I didn't like how much of a big deal my mom made about it. Rushed me to the front of the lines, telling everyone, "You need to let him in right now." I liked not having to wait, but I didn't think Mom needed to be so obnoxious about it. A lot of kids are into one thing for a brief time and then they move on, but it wasn't that way with me. When I liked something, I got obsessed with it. I liked Disney, I liked the Muppets, especially Muppet Babies, I liked Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and above all else, I liked wrestling. Actually, I loved wrestling. Everything about it, and that hasn't changed. My first memories of wrestling are playing with the action figures Clint gave me and watching WWF Superstars of Wrestling and WWF Wrestling Challenge on TV. Even though I couldn't walk, I knew that one day I wanted to be a pro wrestler, just like my hero, the Ultimate Warrior. Over the years, I became a fan of high flyers like the 1-2-3 Kid, character wrestlers like Doink the Clown, and big guys like Diesel. But at the very beginning, it was all about the Warrior for me. Whenever I went over to Grandpa Postl's house, we would rent wrestling tapes from the local video store. We might as well have bought WrestleMania 6 for the number of times we rented it. Seeing the Warrior beat Hulk Hogan for the WWF Championship never got old. Almost every birthday, I'd get the same cake with the Ultimate Warrior on it. One year, for a change, my parents got me a Hulk Hogan cake, and I was really disappointed. Back then, it was Warrior or nothing. A short story, Hasbro. The first Hasbro wrestling figures I remember getting from Clint were the Ultimate Warrior, Andre the Giant, and Hulk Hogan. Clint and I had the same Hogan figure, the Gorilla Press Slam model, but we could tell which one was mine because mine was missing the ring finger on his left hand. Those figures were just the start for me. In time, I'd get the Bear Hug Hogan, which I hated because you couldn't do any of the moves with it apart from the Bear Hug, and the mail-in Hogan with the suplex action. Every time I had to go to one of the Minneapolis hospitals for a checkup, we'd go to the Mall of America. The first time we went there, I must have bought at least 20 figures. Collecting and playing with those toys was my release, but even if I liked the wrestler, it didn't mean I would be a fan of his action figure. Even though the Ultimate Warrior was my hero, I didn't like his first figure, which had the bulky upper body on tiny legs to make a springing action. The second Warrior with the white trunks and Gorilla Press action was much better. The Undertaker's figure was cool because his hand was molded in a way that you could use it to do a chokeslam. Even though I thought the figure of Bret Hart looked more like Elvis with a stupid snarl on his face, it was fun to play with because you could do a lot with it. My least favorite figure of all time was Giant Gonzalez. He had the action where if you pushed him down on his feet, his arms would go up and down. I also didn't like the Legion of Doom figures because their shoulder pads didn't come off, so they weren't ready to wrestle, only to do their entrance. It took WWE years to bring out a 1-2-3 Kid figure, so I pretended one of my Ninja Turtle figures was Kid after he changed his gear from blue to red and silver. Hasbro stopped making the figures in the mid-90s and...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?